Welcome to Fort Knox. I am John Fortt, live at the New York Stock Exchange, and we are going to talk net neutrality, and we're going to talk mega mergers in the media space. I got Fortt Manju of the New York Times joining me. Hey, Fortt.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good, but not as good as AT&T and arguably all of the big ISPs, distributors, the Verizons, the Comcasts. I guess technically this network, CNBC, is owned by Comcast, but I don't get a call from Brian in the morning. What's the significance of this judge's decision to let AT&T buy Time Warner, you think?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of was expected, I think, because the case was a little bit weird, and I don't think people thought it would work, and it didn't. It opens up the floodgates, really. But there were no conditions even. Yeah, I mean, it was a big win. It opens up the floodgates for a lot more of these types of mergers. For a lot of these, telecom and content together are shaping up to be kind of a force to perhaps go against, the big internet companies, and that could be the battle for the future, right? The broadband plus content versus Google, Facebook, Amazon, and we as consumers, because of these mergers and because of the end of net neutrality and generally like this deregulatory environment, we're going to have to, I think it's going to be a lot harder for us to kind of navigate these deals online to figure out, things might get more expensive. They may get cheaper, but there'll be sort of weird and different ways to pay for the internet and for content that'll make things a lot more complicated, I think.
Okay, so you mentioned the end of net neutrality, and that's a big part of what I want to get to throughout the show, because people talk about Title II regulation and net neutrality as if they're the same thing. We had Ajit Pai on Squawk Alley on CNBC a couple days ago, and the trolling he takes on Twitter, amazing. Most of these people, I think, couldn't give you a clear definition of net neutrality if they try. They just say, well, I like a free and open internet. Yeah, we all like a free and open internet. But Fortt, what do you think is really at risk here based on what Ajit Pai and the FCC have done?
I don't agree with the trolling he's taken. I think he's taken a lot of abuse. But I do disagree with his decision. And I do think that this is going to make it more difficult for startups, especially. So one of the reasons people thought about net neutrality, one of the reasons we had this regime is because there was a worry that when competitive new companies came online, they could easily be shut out by bigger companies if there was a way to sort of block them or affect their path to the user, through our broadband lines. And I suspect that will happen. I think that the way that it'll happen, it'll become.
But Fortt, here's the thing, though. The people who control most of the broadband lines, the Comcasts of the world, now AT&Ts, et cetera, they're different, arguably, from the folks who would want to block startups. I mean, Google, Facebook, Amazon are doing just fine, dominating online presence without help from broadband providers. I mean, you think AT&T and Comcast would want to help startups so that there are other competitors for eyeballs and attention online. AT&T's whole rationale behind buying Time Warner was they're getting crowded out by these guys. So where did this idea come from that the ISPs are the main danger to startups?
Well, I mean, the ISPs would just be the vehicle by which the big companies, block the startups. Like, so, if Facebook wanted to fight Snapchat and we didn't have net neutrality, instead of copying their product 1,000 times and, trying to affect them that way, they could have just paid Comcast or paid Verizon or paid AT&T to slightly speed up their own service, right? That's the way that the giants are helped by this decision. The other thing is that in some cases you do have startups that are directly competitive to to the broadband entertainment companies. Netflix arguably is one of those, and there are documented cases of Comcast, for example, many years ago, doing things on the back end that slightly slowed down that kind of traffic. That kind of thing could happen, and under the new regime, it's possible. I mean, there's a lot of scrutiny on the broadband companies now. I don't think they're going to do it immediately, but this stuff is complicated. We don't read the fine print on our broadband and wireless, terms of service, and it's possible that you're going to have these kinds of either blocking or other complicated ways of making it harder for startups to compete fairly in this arena. I don't think it's as big a deal as it used to be, and the reason it's not as big a deal as it used to be is because there are these internet giants that already compete with the startups. So, it's been hard. It's becoming harder and harder for startups to compete in this area, and this just sort of adds one layer of extra complexity.
See, Farhan, I feel like while we weren't looking, while everybody was looking for the big bad ISPs to crush Silicon Valley's innovation, the real danger might have been, I don't know, Google. Listen to Yelp talk about what Google's done for local search. Facebook, look at the dominance that Google and Facebook have in ads. Amazon in retail. But then at the same time, one of the things I push back on against this dominance idea is, Farhad, you remember 15, 20 years ago when the internet was young, how much money a startup had to spend just on Sun servers to get off the ground. I mean, there were enormous barriers to entry then that were cost related. Now a lot of that stuff has been taken away by the cloud, in part by some of these same dominant companies that we worry about. So yes, there are probably going to be costs, but it's not as if there was some era where for free you could set up your internet business and take on the giants. It always cost some money, right?
It's always cost some money, and you're right that it has become easier in some ways to start up a company because you have cloud services, you have app install ads, you have ways to sell your product on Amazon. The problem is that you can easily ramp up, and then you get to a kind of ceiling where it becomes much easier, where you become a acquisition target for these big companies, or you become a target for them to crush you. So many of the consumer internet companies that you saw go public in the last year, Snapchat, Blue Apron, those companies are facing huge competition from the big companies, and they're also paying huge costs to the big companies. Half of Snapchat's revenue, I think, goes to Google to host its services, and so Google's making money from Snapchat while Snapchat is being crushed by Facebook. That's the kind of difficulty you have with these big companies. It makes it much more difficult to kind of get that breakout hit that you might have had 10 years ago. There is some, it is easier,
I don't
but then
know,
sort of
though. I mean, 10 years ago, you were still paying the man if you were trying to be a breakout company. It was just a different man, right? I mean, maybe it was your commercial real estate
maybe there'll always
costs
be a man
because you didn't have. It was commercial real estate because you couldn't afford to have a distributed workforce because you didn't have maybe Google Docs and Microsoft hadn't put Office 365 online yet. Like there were always costs, I would argue. Another thing I want your take on, whenever we talk about net neutrality, my argument is it's a red herring. What this is really about is broadband competition. If we all had the option of 2 or 3 different providers in our local area for broadband, I doubt we'd be so worried about how quickly a particular website was loading on ours. It'd be like wireless service. Hey, if I've got bad service from AT&T at my house, I can switch to Verizon or Sprint or, well, I guess I would say, or T-Mobile. Eventually, they're going to be one. But, I mean, isn't that really the point?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, I don't disagree with that. That's obvious. I mean, the reason that net neutrality rules made sense is because we don't have competition there. So if a lot of people, I think about half of Americans have only one broadband provider to their house. If that broadband provider decides to block or limit or give preferential treatment to some company and you don't like it as a customer, you don't have any recourse nowadays. And it would be nice. And
but here's
for the last.
Thing.
Yeah.
Here's the thing.
For the last 20 years, someone has been trying to build this third pipe.
Place, yeah, but if they remain in place, then arguably, if there's all this red tape and costs to build out the broadband networks, then how are you ever going to get to that era of competition where there are enough options that people get protected? Wouldn't it make sense to have softer touch rules and perhaps regulations versus Title II so that we can even get to the point where there's broadband competition? That's the argument from the other side anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see if that happens. We'll see if the end of these rules leads to the sort of proliferation of new broadband companies. I don't think anyone's predicting that. This has been good for the big broadband companies. It's not, they're doing well because of this, and I don't think that anyone thinks this is going to be, lead to a boon in new kinds of providers. Perhaps we will see, with 5G and with other technologies, we'll see some way to provide another, another path to all those people who have only one broadband provider. I think it's unlikely that this rule is going to do it. There are other ways we could invest a lot of money, the government could, in building out that infrastructure. There are a lot of other ways to build out that kind of support, and I doubt that this rule change is going to be the thing that spurs that kind of innovation or, investment.
Well, let's hear from the controversial figure himself, the chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai. He was on Squawk Alley on CNBC with us just a couple of days ago. Roger McNamee, venture capitalist, is going to join us as well for some text commentary while we watch Ajit Pai. Here he is.
When are we going to see the benefits of what happens today?
From this day forward, I think our interest is making sure that we have a free and open internet and that consumers are able to get better, faster, cheaper internet services. That's what I hear when I travel around the country and talk to consumers everywhere from Los Angeles to the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota to just a couple of weeks ago in Dahlonega, Georgia. This is the regulatory framework that's going to lead to the better internet that consumers want.
Right. You have traveled the country quite a bit. How many states? 26?
28 states, 28 the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And there's a lot of tools in the toolbox that the FCC has used to promote better internet access, including in hurricane disaster zones. And that's something I think we can all agree on.
So you think we're at the cusp of a wave of investment in rural internet?
I absolutely do think so, for a couple of different reasons. Number one, these are underserved areas where the business case for building out networks is hard enough as it is. By relaxing some of these rules and by promoting more investment, we're going to see more consumers, the 34 million Americans who are offline, get online. And that's a lot of human capital that's been sitting on the shelf for too long.
This whole net neutrality brouhaha is a red herring. It's really about broadband competition. If people had everywhere a wide swath of options for fast service, then, competition would work it out. If somebody is blocking or throttling, you switch to somebody else. We saw it play out in wireless, but we're not there yet. So how long before we are? Does 5G and the spectrum stuff you mentioned really start to finally solve that problem so that people across the country have options?
I think 5G is going to be tremendous, and all of the other competitors, satellite, for example, is going to make a major competitive force. That's part of the reason why we're moving so quickly to get more 5G spectrum into the marketplace. We're holding our first auctions in November in terms of 5G spectrum.
So how long?
I mean, it's hard to forecast, but we're moving very quickly. In July, for example, we're holding a $2 billion auction to get fixed broadband into unserved parts of the country. And not just the telcos that everyone's familiar with, electrical cooperatives, small cable companies in small towns. All of these companies are going to have a chance to compete for these dollars. We want to move very quickly, and that's something I think where you put your finger on it. That is what consumers are really concerned about, getting access, getting competition. And that's the regulatory approach that we embrace.
A number of states, I think it's 29 as of last month, have taken some sort of measure, or lawmakers have proposed some sort of law to keep net neutrality in place, at least on a state level. How are you going to proceed with that? I
think what we're going to do is take a look at, on a case-by-case basis, at each state law and determine the right course. But at a broad level, the internet is inherently an interstate service. If I send an email to you right now, it probably crosses state boundaries. So inherently, it's something that has to be regulated by the federal government. We don't every one of the 50 states and however many local jurisdictions to have a bite at the regulatory apple. So we're going to decide the right way forward. But overall, the federal deregulatory approach that we embraced is, I think, the right one.
If there is a case of a provider throttling in coverage in any way, will you have to enforce it to make an example of them? Do you expect to have to do that?
Absolutely. We're going to be a cop on the beat. The FCC has a robust transparency rule. The Federal Trade Commission is expressly empowered, and the new chairman, Joe Simons, has said that he will take a look at any anti-competitive conduct in the internet economy. And that's going forward the way that consumers are going to be protected, both with the FCC and the FTC as cops on the beat.
It was a controversial move when you said that ISPs, internet service providers, their data collection, data use ought to be policed the same way that Facebook's and Google's are. And so that all ought to belong with the FTC. At the time, people were concerned about the ISPs and all the information that they have on us. But since then, we've had Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal. Last week, Amazon came out with the Fire TV Cube, which sits in between the consumer and the set-top box and is going to know by voice what you're watching. You feel vindicated?
Look, the Australian regulators, I think, are looking at the Android platform as well. All I will say is that it proves my basic point that the Federal Trade Commission is the right place to regulate privacy for consumers online. If you're a consumer, you don't care whether it's a network operator or a content company that is holding your information, sensitive information. You want that information to be protected regardless. And the FTC is the only agency that can consistently protect you when you go online.
So, the big get bigger, Farhad. That seems to be one of the themes we're getting out of the combination of AT&T being allowed to purchase Time Warner, and then what many expect the impact of net neutrality to be. But I don't know, that there often seems to be a fly in the ointment here when you think you've got the giants locked down. Remember when we thought it was AOL and who else? Yahoo looked big for a while there. Microsoft was not to be messed with or defeated. And, let 5 or 10 years pass and the landscape has shifted. Is it going to be different this time?
Yeah. It's always risky to make a this time is different argument, but this time does feel slightly different because for the last 5 years, it's been the same companies, right? We haven't seen a radical change in the kinds of companies, consumer internet companies that we deal with. It's been Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and those look like the companies that will be with us in the future,
Netflix,
in the foreseeable future.
Netflix is arguably forcing the hands of Google, Apple, and Amazon into a type of content that they hadn't planned on doing. Silicon Valley used to be allergic to the idea of content. Everybody looked at Microsoft and NBC getting together. I can say that, I guess, because they're part of Comcast, and said, we don't want to deal with that kind of a mess. Let's maybe rent the content, but we don't want to own.
Yeah, Netflix is doing well. Netflix is also spending a lot of money, and it's it's sort of at least near term or long term path is not obvious. It's not profitable. We'll see what happens. It's hard to kind of make bets on companies that are losing money as like the savior for the consumer internet business.
Yeah. So going back to this net neutrality disagreement, so many people are pissed off at Ajit Pai for the Title II repeal. But it sounds like when you listen to him, when you listen to what he just said, the goal of having broadband competition, the promise that the FCC is going to be a cop on the beat if anybody tries to block or throttle. Because we got to remember, Title II wasn't just about blocking and throttling. It was about a certain process that you had to go through in order to build out broadband, because it's to be treated as a utility. So the same way you'd have to go if you wanted to build out power lines, for example. is it possible that there's a middle ground, or at least a room for respectful disagreement, and we shouldn't necessarily be talking about the death of net neutrality when really we want to be talking about the death of Title II regulation?
I mean, there is no way to sort of preserve net neutrality without Title II legally. Like, there's been this court challenge to it without Title II, so it's hard to know how that happens. And if the FCC or the FTC, says they're going to be a cop on the beat here, that would be nice, but it's not sort of borne out by the history of the last 10 years, right? The American regulators have been completely lax in policing these companies, broadband companies and internet giants. You mentioned the Google Yelp thing earlier. The FTC just, pulled out of that one, decided not to police that, while European regulators did. So I'm not that hopeful that we'll see this very strong cop on the beat here. Maybe things have changed, but it seems like we're in a deregulatory environment, and I don't think the regulators are going to, step up and start policing this stuff now.
Roger continues to join us by text, making the point that monopolies in tech and communications seem not to have many constraints today. And Farhad, you make the point, which I think is interesting for a lot of viewers who might not naturally get this, that the standard in Europe, or at least the way they regulate, is different from the way we regulate in the U.S. I mean, it's not that being a monopoly is illegal. It's abusing monopoly power that's illegal. And in Europe, the standard for the abuse of monopoly power is when you harm competition, so other businesses. With the way that you conduct your business. In the U.S., it's harm of the consumer. So even if you are a monopolist and you are crushing your competitors left and right by lowering prices, as long as consumers are getting lower prices, it's fine. Farhad, is that an idea that you think is going to be revisited for the digital era? Because that concept of antitrust and what it means was really developed before we had the internet.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of energy on this, and this is where sort of the big thinking is in Washington on antitrust is, do we need some new way to think about policing sort of monopoly power or just huge concentrations of market power that's different from the way we've been doing it in the kind of pre-digital era? It's a long, slow fight. I mean, this is about court cases. This is about sort of changing the regulators. This will happen over time, and I don't think we should look at it to, I don't think we should think about it as a savior for the problems that we have online now, but I do think it's worth entertaining, and we're seeing sort of on the left and the right, a rethinking about antitrust policy. But I will say, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time.
Yeah. Matt Black, who's watching, makes the point. He says, skip 5G and let's do Halo Wi-Fi and have Wi-Fi anywhere in the world and get it cheap to Africa, Iraq, first responders. Matt, thanks for weighing in. I would point out 5G actually enables that kind of thing, being able to blanket an internet signal at lower power and allow people to have basic communication. So arguably the shift to 5G, it's not just about speed, it really is about coverage and battery life and different types of smart connections. Also, Roger continues to weigh in on these issues of monopoly power and points out that when it comes to the Internet of Things, data collection is an issue. It's a problem. And Farhad, when you read the judge's decision on this AT&T Time Warner merger, allowing it, it's almost scary that he points out, well, really prices for overall services likely to come down. Ads are going to get more targeted because for AT&T, this is really about data. It's about having deeper customer data to be able to target things more specifically, with permission granted. But we just went through this scandal about how much Cambridge Analytica was able to figure out about people psychographically based on the data they got from Facebook. It sounds like AT&T Time Warner is after the same thing. Why aren't people talking more about the implications of these big, perhaps monopolistic companies with monopoly power having enormous data stores on all of us Americans? Isn't that an issue that perhaps we should be thinking about regulatorily? It's Farhad, it's never happened like this before.
Yeah, I mean, this is you're right. The broadband companies see the data that they can get from our internet lines as as something, as a kind of a defense against the data that the internet companies are collecting from us kind of voluntarily. So if your ISP can kind of get the same kind of targeted profile of you that Facebook does just by what you do on your internet line, that's extremely valuable to them. They might even give you a price discount because of it, because they can make money from that data in lots of other ways. And so this is I think the next big frontier. Like, we're going to have this kind of targeted, ad-supported home and wireless internet service that also sort of has these bundles of other of data and entertainment systems added to it. It'll become a lot more. I think it'll become a lot more like how we buy cable, like how we have purchased, how we purchased media, 10 years ago than it is now. It's going to change rapidly, I think, and the way that it's going to change is going to. I think in some ways it defies prediction, but in some ways it might be a return. It might be a return to some of what how we used to pay for media in the past.
Yeah, longtime Fort Knox viewers that I have know that I have a little paranoid streak in the sense that I don't have an Amazon Echo in the house or a Google Home. I don't believe in big companies having open microphones in my house because, hey, accidents happen, right? I saw that thing a couple of weeks ago where there was a woman and her husband having a conversation, and the Echo thought that they said Alexa, and so woke up, recorded their whole conversation, and thought they said to send it to one of his employees, and so sent it.
Right.
I don't know. Once you have a whole bunch of companies that have that level of capability, and they all want to have a remote control that you can talk to, and they're gathering all this data on it, and it's essential to their business model to know things about us that we don't necessarily want to tell them, it freaks me out a little. Doesn't it call for some level of specific oversight over companies that have a certain level of data? I don't know, just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does call for some oversight. The problem here is it's all happening in a way that's not transparent to you. So, we understand kind of implicitly that if you put, an Echo or any other kind of Internet of Things device in your house, that it's monitoring you in some way. But that the way that the data from all of these devices can be put together to present like some kind of very deep profile of you, and really just kind of like a dossier of what you do every day and when you're coming and going, that I don't think we can understand that as consumers, as non-engineers. You don't really sort of understand the kind of big kind of God view picture that these companies can have of you. And the lesson of the internet over the last couple years, Cambridge Analytica, these stories about price fixing in Bitcoin, is that there's a lot of data out there and a lot of sort of people doing underhanded things with it that no one may have imagined. Like, I've talked to people, who worked with and used to work on the Facebook ad system. I don't think any of them really ever intuited the idea that the Russians might use the ad system or the news feed as a way to affect American elections. It happened. It was a threat that no one kind of imagined. And these kinds of threats, will keep coming around because there's all this data and there's all this stuff that's that no one is kind of policing. There's no, as you say, there's no kind of overarching cop here to look at these privacy, the private data these companies have, these devices are getting on you, and the way they're all being put together.
Yeah, it's because it's all 20-year-olds were coming up with this stuff 10 years ago. I don't know. They hadn't become old and crusty and cynical like us, Farhad. I mean, they're talking about changing the world. Yeah, they changed the world, all right. It's a different world. It's not in the way you thought, whippersnapper Zuckerberg. Now that he's married with a couple kids, he can see more clearly.
Yeah.
We know how that goes. Farhad, it's a conversation we're going to keep having about big, massive tech and media companies with tons of data and what they're going to do next. Thanks for debating me a little bit on it for Fort Knox Live. I appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks a lot.
And thanks, everybody, for joining us this week on the podcast, coming up in just a couple of days, Q-Tip from Tribe Called Quest. I mean, I can hardly believe it myself. Tyler, producer for Squawk Alley, managed to book Q-Tip. It was a great conversation. We talked about, I mean, everything from comic books. He makes a metaphor involving Galactus to what's up with these huge companies, including Apple, where Q-Tip has Abstract Radio on Apple Music, and Pandora and Amazon and Google, what they're really doing for and to the music business. He also talks about Payne losing Fife, the last days of A Tribe Called Quest. Be sure to catch that on the Fortt Knox